In the frozen heart of Manhattan, winter of 1889, a laundress opens the attic door to a stranger cloaked in silence and wounds. He hides more than his name. He hides a truth that could shatter the city's elite. She was meant to wash linens and disappear, but fate handed her the key to a secret that the most powerful men on Wall Street would kill to protect. What begins as mercy will become a war between justice and survival, between love and social ruin. And in a world where a woman like her is never meant to matter, she will change everything. Where are you listening from tonight? And tell us, do you believe love can truly bridge two worlds? Manhattan, winter of 1889. Snow pressed against the tall windows of the boarding house like a silent curtain, muffling the noise of horses and wheels below. The city breathed smoke and coal, its heart pulsing with industry, ambition, and secrets. Inside the boarding house at the corner of Delancey Street, the air was heavy with starch, steam, and quiet resignation. Lucille Gardner's hands, raw from soap and water, moved methodically across a lace chemise, rinsing, wringing, folding. She had risen before dawn, as she did each morning, descending into the laundry cellar where her world was defined by boiling vats, cracked basins, and the hum of other women's whispers. She was 30, unmarried, and fading into the walls of a city that never paused to see her. But behind the calm of her downcast eyes was a soul that had not yet learned how to harden. That afternoon, Mrs. Farnsworth called her up to the narrow service corridor. The matron's shawl was pulled tightly around her stout shoulders, her tone clipped, her glance over Lucille's figure brisk and appraising. "There's a man upstairs," she said without preamble. "We found him behind the servants' stairwell. He's wounded, breathing but barely." Lucille blinked. "Who is he?" "We don't know. He won't speak a word. He needs care, and I can't risk the other girls gossiping. You're quiet. You don't meddle. See to him. And not a word." She wanted to refuse. She should have. But something in the woman's eyes, perhaps urgency, perhaps fear, unsettled her. And so she climbed, lantern in hand, to the dusty attic chamber no one had used in years. The door creaked open to reveal a shadow stretched across a narrow cot. The man lay still, covered by a coarse wool blanket, face turned toward the wall. The room smelled of old timber and stale blood. Lucille stepped inside, her breath catching. He was not what she expected. He was unshaven, cheeks hollow, a bruise blooming beneath one eye, but there was something unmistakably elegant about the angle of his jaw, the shape of his hands resting weakly on his chest. His coat, though torn and weathered, was of fine tailoring, the kind she washed only for ladies' husbands who paid with heavy coins and light contempt. She set the lantern down and approached with slow, deliberate steps. "I'm here to help you," she murmured. His eyelids fluttered open. For a moment he looked at her with such piercing clarity that it startled her. Grey-blue eyes, clouded by fever, but sharp enough to notice everything. Then he turned his gaze back to the ceiling, offering no answer. Lucille spent the next hours fetching cloths, warm broth, and boiled water. She cleaned the gash on his side, sponged the dried blood from his temple. He did not wince, did not thank her, only stared in silence, like a man who had lost something far greater than blood. That night, as she folded his coat to place it near the hearth, her fingers brushed against the inner pocket. A scrap of silk slipped out, a handkerchief, fine and white, its corner embroidered in gold thread. E.H. Lucille froze. Her heart began to pound, not in panic, but in something colder, something that slithered through her veins like the wind curling through the attic rafters. The papers. She had seen that monogram before, on the front page of the New York Tribune. A name beneath a headline that shouted scandal, ruin, and mystery. She glanced back at the man. His face was turned toward the wall, breath shallow, lips parted in uneasy sleep. Lucille held the handkerchief to her chest, her throat dry. She had come to mend a stranger. But now, the weight of that embroidered corner told her, She might have stepped into the secret of the most hunted tycoon in New York. The days that followed unfurled like a ribbon dipped in ink, saturated with silence, tension, and the quiet pull of something unnamed. Manhattan's winter deepened, coiling its cold fingers through every brick and beam of the boarding house, seeping beneath doors and through cracks in the wooden floorboards. The wind outside moaned like a widow, and the snow no longer danced but fell with weight, thick and unrelenting, blanketing the city in ghostly white. In the laundry cellar, where warmth came only from boiling vats and blistered fingers, Lucille Gardner returned to her station as though nothing in her world had shifted. Yet something had, something deep beneath her ribs, something she dared not name. She carried on scrubbing collars and cuffs, folding damp chemises into orderly piles, but her thoughts drifted upward to the attic room where he lay, the man with hollow eyes and a ruined coat. The man who had not spoken his name, but whose monogrammed handkerchief whispered a truth louder than any confession. E.H. The initials pulsed in her memory with every movement of her hands. She had hidden the handkerchief deep in the seam of her mattress, not yet ready to confront the meaning it carried. The newspapers had painted Edmund Hale as a ruthless tycoon, a man who had vanished after causing financial ruin to hundreds. But the man upstairs, he did not seem capable of such cruelty. He slept uneasily, murmuring half-formed words as though pursued by ghosts. He had not asked for help, he had barely accepted it. Lucille had not spoken a word of her discovery, not even to Mrs. Farnsworth, who watched her now with sharper eyes than usual. The matron had grown increasingly uneasy. She lingered longer near the cellar door, interrupted Lucille's work with questions that sounded casual, but were not. "You've been going up there too often," she said one morning, arms folded tightly over her apron. "The man doesn't need coddling. You're not his nurse." Lucille kept her gaze low, the bristles of her brush scrubbing at a stubborn wine stain. "He can barely sit upright, ma'am. He still needs food, clean cloth. It's only what anyone would do." Mrs. Farnsworth snorted. "Anyone with sense would stay far away. He didn't fall through that roof by accident. You've a good name in this house, Miss Gardner. Don't throw it into the fire." With that, she turned and climbed the steps, her keys jangling like a warning bell. Lucille stared after her, a drop of water slipping down her sleeve, cold as doubt. Upstairs, the man was improving, though slowly. His fever had lessened, and he had begun to eat what she brought him, modest portions of broth, bread, and sometimes a bit of apple she had managed to buy from the cart boy down the block. He still said little, but when he did speak, it was with a voice that betrayed education, restraint, and wounds older than his bruises. He never asked her name, yet he began addressing her softly as Miss. Never girl, never you, but Miss. And in that simple courtesy, Lucille felt more seen than in all her 30 years of silent toil. By the third week, the boarding house stirred with a new kind of energy. Word travelled quickly in corridors and stairwells, carried by whispers too low to name. Someone new had arrived. Lucille first saw him as she crossed the vestibule with a bundle of clean linens. He stood beside the coat rack, tall and slender, with a bowler hat under his arm and a travelling case by his feet. His overcoat was grey with a black velvet collar, and his gloves were the kind worn not for warmth but for style. His moustache was carefully waxed, and his eyes, green and calculating, swept the room with the ease of a man who already knew more than he let on. Elias Brodie. He introduced himself to Mrs. Farnsworth as a writer for a national publication, researching urban life among the working class. She nodded, cautious but polite, and offered him a room on the second floor. He moved in that afternoon. By evening, every tenant knew his name. Lucille felt a chill each time she passed him in the hallway. His gaze lingered too long, his questions disguised in charm. "Where might a man get a decent cup of tea in this part of town?" "You've lived here long." "Interesting place, this house, full of stories, I imagine." She answered with short replies and eyes lowered, but she sensed he was watching. Perhaps not just her, but every corner of the building. In the attic, she grew more careful. She whispered now when speaking to her patient, listened for every creak of the stairs. The man, Edmund, if her suspicions were correct, had begun to sit up, to move with quiet effort. He had not yet asked for news of the world, but his eyes darted toward the lantern when it flickered, toward the window when the wind howled. He was a man who had once commanded his world, and who now feared it. One evening, as Lucille carried up a bowl of potato soup wrapped in a cloth, she heard voices echoing through the stairwell. She paused, halfway up, holding her breath. "I tell you, he's in this building," Brody's voice murmured, low and confident. "He wouldn't have gone far, not in that state. Hale's not a fool. He knows how to vanish, but this has his fingerprints." Lucille gripped the wooden rail. The name struck her chest like thunder. "You sure it's him?" came the reply, muffled by the distance. "Not yet, but I've got a feeling. I'll smoke him out, one way or another." Footsteps retreated down the corridor. Lucille stood frozen, the soup trembling in her hands, her breath caught between fear and fury. That night when she reached the attic, her hands were shaking. She placed the bowl down and turned toward the man in the cot. "I heard someone," she said, voice barely a whisper. "A man named Brody. He's looking for someone. Someone he called Hale." He met her gaze then, fully and without disguise. His eyes were sharp now, no longer dulled by pain. His jaw tensed, but he said nothing. "I think he means you," she said softly. He looked down, then exhaled slowly. "Then I haven't much time." It was the first true sentence he had spoken to her, and it chilled her more than the snow outside. Lucille stepped back, heart pounding, the weight of her choices closing around her like the city's fog. She could no longer pretend ignorance. She had welcomed a fugitive into her care, and now, whether she wished it or not, she was part of his secret. Outside, the wind howled louder, and in the darkness of the attic, Edmund Hale finally opened his eyes wide and watched her with something between gratitude and fear. The snow had not stopped falling since before dawn, blanketing the rooftops of Manhattan in a silence too pure for a city built on ambition and smoke. The iron railings outside the boarding house were frosted over, and the streets echoed only with the muffled steps of carriage horses and the clink of coal wagons making their slow rounds. Inside, the warmth was scarce, except for the simmering tension that had begun to hum beneath the floorboards like a hidden furnace. Lucille Gardner stood at the attic threshold, the lantern in her hand casting long shadows on the slanted ceiling. Her eyes searched the half-darkness until they found him, the man who had remained nameless, who had hidden behind pain and fever and silence. But the silence had begun to crack, and she could no longer pretend not to see the truth behind those pale eyes. He sat upright now, propped against the wall with a thin woolen blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His cheeks were less sunken, but the bruise beneath his eye had deepened to a shadow of violet and yellow. His gaze lifted slowly toward her, calm yet distant, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "I need to know," Lucille said, her voice low but firm, carrying the weight of sleepless nights and half-formed suspicions. "You can't stay here, in this attic, while a stranger walks the halls asking questions you don't want answered." He said nothing at first, only studied her. The way her brows drew together in worry, the way her hands, strong and reddened from laundry water, clutched the lantern like a shield. Then, slowly, he lowered his gaze and exhaled. "Miss Gardner," he murmured, his voice rough, as if rarely used. "I never meant to involve you. I intended to leave long before anyone would notice me." "But someone has noticed," she replied, stepping closer, the lantern's glow revealing the thin tremor in her jaw. "His name is Brody. He's asking around. He used your name." There was a long pause, a pause so heavy it seemed to thicken the air between them, and then, at last, he gave her what she asked for. "My name is Edmund Hale," he said quietly. "I imagine you've already suspected it." The name settled into the room like dust, familiar, dangerous, real. Lucille stood still, absorbing it, as if it might burn her tongue just to say it aloud. "Why are you here?" she asked. Why are you hiding in this place, if not because you're running from justice? He looked at her fully this time, with a gaze that no longer concealed itself. A gaze filled with exhaustion, pride, and something more fragile beneath it. Something like shame. I was attacked, he said, left for dead. I woke in an alley, bleeding and alone. I don't know who sent the men, but I know why. There were signatures forged in my name. Accounts opened that I never touched. And when the collapse came, they needed someone to blame. I was the most useful scapegoat. Lucille's breath caught. She did not want to believe him, because belief meant more than trust. It meant entanglement. But he spoke with a stillness that did not beg for sympathy, only understanding. Then why not go to the police, she asked. Would you, Miss Gardner? He replied. If you were the man they already believe guilty, if you had lost your name, your wealth, your voice, who would listen to you? The words struck something inside her, something raw and buried. She thought of all the times she had spoken and not been heard, of how her name had never appeared on a ledger, how her existence had been boiled down to numbers on a payslip and cloth folded by hands no one remembered. She said nothing, but he must have seen the flicker in her eyes. I don't expect you to trust me, he added, softer now, but I've told you the truth. You may do with it what you will. Lucille set the lantern down on the floor beside the cot, the flame swaying within the glass. Her hands, though steady, trembled slightly at the tips. She knelt before him, not in supplication but in exhaustion. She had not meant to sit, but her body no longer waited for permission. He reached for the bowl of broth she had brought. Their hands touched just briefly, but the contact was enough to silence the room. His fingers were warm despite the cold air, his touch feather-light, but deliberate, not accidental. Thank you, he said, his voice gentler now, for everything. It wasn't the words that moved her, it was the way he looked at her as he said them, as if no one had thanked her in years, as if her kindness wasn't expected but cherished. Her chest ached with the tenderness of it, with the unspoken invitation between two people who had nothing to offer each other but presence. She stood abruptly, turning away. You should eat before it gets cold. He nodded, understanding. Neither of them spoke again. That night, she returned to her room but did not sleep. The handkerchief remained hidden in her mattress, but it no longer mattered. The truth had already unfolded itself in his voice, in the slow breaking of his silence. Edmund Hale was not merely a fugitive. He was a man unraveling, trying to cling to what little truth he had left. By morning, the boarding house had taken on a strange quiet. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Lucille made her way down to the cellar, steam rising around her as she resumed her work. Her body moved with habit, but her mind wandered. She was bent over the basin, scrubbing a collar, when footsteps descended the stairs behind her. She knew they were not Mrs. Farnsworth's. These steps were lighter, measured, unfamiliar. Miss Gardner, came a voice, smooth as oiled wood. She turned slowly. Elias Brodie stood before her, wearing a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. In his gloved hands, he held a folded newspaper. I wonder if I might borrow a moment of your time, he said. I've been speaking to some of the tenants, just trying to get a sense of the character of this place. Lucille wiped her hands on her apron and nodded, her expression guarded. Brodie stepped closer, unfolding the newspaper. His fingers moved with the theatrical precision of a magician revealing his final trick. I came across something curious, he said, tapping the headline. Lucille's eyes dropped to the page. There it was, the grainy image of a face she knew too well, the same eyes that had stared into hers with weary gratitude, the same name, Edmund Hale, printed in bold above the article. She felt her throat tighten. The print blurred for a moment, not from the ink but from the heat rising behind her eyes. I imagine if he were hiding, Brodie said, watching her carefully. He'd need someone's help, someone discreet, someone kind. Lucille said nothing. Brodie smiled, folding the newspaper again with a precise flick of his fingers. People talk, Miss Gardner. I've learned to listen well." He tipped his hat and turned to leave. Lucille remained frozen in place, the scent of soap and starch sharp in her lungs. Her hands trembled at her sides. She had crossed an invisible line. Whatever choice she made next, she would not be able to walk it back. The city outside the boarding house had begun to thaw. The icicles that had hung from the gutters like glass daggers were melting, dripping rhythmically onto the cobblestones below. The air carried the scent of damp brick, chimney smoke, and far-away carriage grease. Inside, however, the chill remained, an invisible frost that clung not to walls but to hearts. Lucille Gardner could feel it everywhere, in the way Mrs. Farnsworth's eyes lingered too long on her, in the way the tenants grew quieter when she passed, and most of all, in the way Elias Brodie now occupied every shadow of the building, his boots echoing through the corridors like the steps of fate itself. He had questioned her twice since that afternoon in the laundry room. Both times he was courteous, almost charming, but there was a weight behind his politeness that made Lucille's skin prickle. Each word seemed designed to test her, to measure whether she would falter under the pressure of his calm scrutiny. She lied well enough, or at least she thought she did, but every falsehood came at a cost. That cost was fear. Upstairs in the narrow attic, the man she risked everything to protect was regaining strength. Edmund Hale, the fallen tycoon whispered about in every cafe and parlour, had begun to move about on his own. He no longer looked like the ghost she had found weeks earlier. His colour had returned, faint but steady. He spent his hours seated near the single window, the light outlining the edges of his profile, sharp and melancholy. He spoke little of the world beyond those walls, yet when he did, his words were precise, weighed with thought. And when he smiled, on those rare occasions, it was the kind of smile that undid her composure, because it felt undeserved. She told herself he smiled out of gratitude, out of civility, but in her heart, she feared it was something deeper, something she should not allow. That evening, as dusk settled over the city like a slow exhale, Lucille climbed the attic stairs, carrying a small ledger and a stub of pencil. Mrs. Farnsworth had been late paying her that week, and the laundry accounts were tangled. She had decided to tally them by candlelight before sleep. When she entered the attic, Edmund looked up from his chair. "You work even at this hour?" he asked. She hesitated. "I'm not one to sleep with numbers undone." He gestured toward the small crate that served as a table. "Sit. Let me see." Lucille frowned slightly, unsure. "It's only laundry accounts, sir." "Nothing of interest to a man who once handled fortunes." "Perhaps not," he said softly, "but numbers are numbers, Miss Gardner, and if you'll forgive me, you seem ready to fall asleep over them." His tone was teasing, but gentle. Against her better judgment, she sat. The candle between them flickered its flame, catching the reflection of his eyes, steady, observant, and far too knowing. She handed him the ledger reluctantly. He studied the columns in silence, his brow furrowing as he read. Then, taking the pencil, he made a few notes in the margins. "Here," he said, tapping the page. "You've been underpaid for the last 3 weeks. Whoever calculated this has taken half a day's wage from you each time." Lucille blinked, startled. "That can't be right. Mrs. Farnsworth said the rates were reduced for fuel costs." He looked up sharply. "Reduced for her, perhaps. Not for you." Lucille's throat tightened. "It's not my place to question her." "It should be," he said, the words low but fierce. Then, as if realizing he had spoken too harshly, he softened. "You give so much of yourself, Miss Gardner. Don't let the world take more than it deserves." She lowered her gaze, her pulse quickening at the unexpected intensity of his voice. His kindness disarmed her more than any cruelty could have. They worked side by side for nearly an hour. He recalculated her totals, explaining patiently, occasionally glancing at her to ensure she understood. She listened, half to the numbers, half to the rhythm of his voice. Measured, calm, touched with the remnants of refinement that marked him as someone born into another life. At one point, their hands brushed as they turned a page. Neither moved away. The air between them seemed to hum faintly, alive with something they both pretended not to feel. Lucille's breath caught first. She drew her hand back, rising to her feet, as if distance could erase what had passed. "I should go," she said, her voice unsteady. "It's late." He looked up at her, that same gentle smile ghosting his lips. "Thank you for trusting me." "It isn't trust," she murmured, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. "It's necessity." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Edmund's eyes softened, as though he could see the struggle she carried, the pull between reason and emotion, between caution and yearning. Before she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Lucille," he said quietly, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his mouth was both startling and intimate. "You've saved my life more times than I can count. I owe you more than I can ever repay." She turned slightly, meeting his gaze through the flickering light. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Hale. I only did what any decent person would do." "That's where you're wrong," he said. "Decency has become a rare currency in this city. You've given me more than kindness. You've given me reason." Her heart twisted at his words. She wanted to answer, to tell him that reason was dangerous when it came wrapped in gratitude and longing. But she couldn't. So she left the words unsaid, carrying their weight with her as she descended the narrow stairs. The next morning brought new unease. Brody had begun spending more time in the parlor, talking to the tenants with easy laughter and false warmth. His eyes followed Lucille whenever she passed, though he pretended not to notice her. Mrs. Farnsworth, too, had grown more suspicious. She muttered to herself about strangers taking liberties and charity leading to ruin. Lucille's nerves frayed under their scrutiny. Each time she climbed to the attic, she checked the hallway twice. Each time she left, she made sure no one followed. She no longer dared to stay long, yet she could not stay away. One evening, she found Edmund by the window, staring at the city lights. He looked stronger now, though still pale. A newspaper lay folded beside him, untouched. "You should be resting," she said softly. "I've done enough resting," he replied without turning. "It's strange, isn't it? A city can glitter like this, streets filled with gaslight, theaters open, music in the parlors, and still be a cage." Lucille approached slowly. "You speak as though you've lost something beyond wealth." He turned to her, a sad smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I lost my sister 3 years ago. Scarlet fever. She was all the family I had left. I built everything for her. Every contract, every late hour, every coin earned. And when she died, I thought perhaps my work would give her memory weight. Now I see it gave me nothing but chains." His voice trembled slightly. It was the first time she had heard him speak of love, of any kind, and it broke something open in her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "No one deserves to bear that kind of grief alone." He looked at her then, truly looked, and she felt the air tighten, charged with emotion neither of them had intended to invite. There was a tenderness in his expression that frightened her because it mirrored her own. For a long moment they stood in silence. The candle on the table flickered between them, its flame dancing in the draught that slipped through the window cracks. If either moved an inch closer, the fragile line between them would vanish. But neither did. Lucille drew back first, her composure trembling like fine glass. "I should leave. Mrs. Farnsworth doesn't like me being up here after dark." He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then I won't keep you." She turned, reaching for the door. Her hand was on the knob when the sound of footsteps echoed on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate, the sound of authority. The door swung open before she could react. Mrs. Farnsworth stood there, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes sharp and furious. "So it's true," she hissed. "You've been hiding him, lying to me." Lucille's blood ran cold. "Mrs. Farnsworth, please, I can explain." "Enough," the older woman snapped. "You've brought danger under my roof. If the police come asking, I'll not risk my livelihood for your foolishness." Lucille's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Behind her, Edmund had risen to his feet, his face pale in the lamplight. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Farnsworth said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife, "you'll pack your things and be gone." Lucille stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The candle flickered between them, its light casting 3 wavering shadows on the wall, one of power, one of shame, and one of love, too fragile to name. The sun had risen weak and reluctant over Manhattan, its pale light breaking through the sooty haze above the rooftops. Though the snow had mostly melted from the streets, a chill clung to the city like memory, unseen, unwelcome, impossible to shake. Inside the boarding house, the walls felt tighter. Conversations halted when footsteps passed. Glances were exchanged behind doors barely ajar. It was not just gossip now, it was suspicion. Lucille Gardner moved through the hallways as if walking a tightrope, her movements deliberate, her shoulders taut beneath her shawl. She had not slept. The matron's threat echoed in her chest with every breath. She had packed her few belongings in silence, folded each dress with care, and placed her savings, 15 crumpled dollars, inside a linen handkerchief, knotted tightly in her pocket. But she had not yet left. The attic still held him, Edmund Hale, the man whose name could ruin her, whose eyes had thanked her without speaking, whose presence had unraveled the quiet order of her days. She had gone to him that morning, against all reason, driven by something deeper than fear. He stood by the window when she entered, dressed in an old coat she had mended for him. He looked stronger now, but wearier too. The weight of returning strength was a heavy thing when paired with helplessness. "I'm leaving today," she said without ceremony. He turned slowly, eyes meeting hers with quiet resignation. "She told you to." Lucille nodded. "And I have no choice. I've already stayed longer than I should." He stepped forward, his voice low. "Lucille, you don't get to say my name like that," she said, more sharply than she meant to. "Not as if we're equals. We're not. You come from gold-plated doors and marble floors. I come from cold soot and boiling lie. The day you leave this room, your life will go on. You'll reclaim your name, your power. And I," her voice caught, "I'll carry the ruin." Edmund flinched as if struck. "You think I don't know what I've cost you?" "No," she whispered. "I think you've never had to think about it. Not truly." A heavy silence fell between them. Only the distant clatter of wagon wheels filtered in from the street below. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "You're right," he said. "I haven't known your world, not as you live it. I was raised in rooms where servants appeared before I asked, where cold fingers never touched my skin. I never questioned where the warmth came from, or who paid for it." He looked at her then, his expression stripped of pride. "But I see it now. I see you." The words struck something inside her. Not the usual soft ache of flattery, but a deeper wound, the longing to be seen, not as a shadow passing through someone else's life, but as a woman of flesh, heart, thought, and will. Still, she turned away. "You don't understand what it means to be afraid of needing someone." "I do now," he said. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Moments passed. When she finally looked at him again, his hand was resting on the edge of the small crate they used as a table. A worn envelope sat there, the flap brittle, the ink faded. "I didn't want to show you this," he said, "but I have nothing else left to offer." She stepped closer, drawn not by curiosity, but by the quiet ache in his voice. "These are deeds," he explained. "Letters, signatures I never signed, contracts I never saw. They were kept in a warehouse on Bowery Street. I had a clerk, before the collapse, who hid them for me when everything fell apart. If I can retrieve them, I might prove I was framed. That I never touched the money they say I stole." Lucille took the envelope with careful fingers. "Then you need to go. Tonight. Before someone else finds you." "I can't do it alone," he said. "I need someone who knows the streets. Someone no one would suspect." The implication hovered between them. "No," she said softly, "not again. You've already cost me my home. I won't let you cost me my soul." But she didn't return the envelope. That night, as the city slipped into a restless slumber, Lucille walked the streets beneath a dull yellow moon. The cobblestones were slick with grime, the shop fronts shuttered. Her heart pounded with each step, not from fear of shadows, but of what she was becoming. She told herself she wasn't helping him, that she was retrieving something simple, something harmless, that it wasn't loyalty, it wasn't longing, it was logic. But the truth pressed against her chest like a question unspoken. She reached the warehouse district just before midnight, the fog rising like steam from the sewer grates. She had wrapped her coat tightly, a bonnet pulled low over her brow, her hands deep in her pockets. She found the alley between two cold, dark buildings and slipped behind the crates near the side entrance, where Edmund had told her the documents might be kept. A soft knock behind her made her spin. A man stood there, average height, coat too clean, gloves too fine. He stepped into the lamplight. Not Edmund. Her breath caught. "Miss Gardner," the man said pleasantly, as if they were old acquaintances meeting by accident. "Funny finding you here." Lucille backed up a step. "You followed me." Elias Brody smiled, calm and courteous. "Of course I did. You move like someone with something to hide." She said nothing. He stepped closer. "You're brave. I'll give you that. But bravery and foolishness often share a thin line. Tell me where he is. Save yourself the trouble." She turned to run. He caught her by the arm, not harshly, but firmly, his fingers pressing just enough to bruise. She twisted, but he held fast. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice low. "But you've involved yourself in a game you don't understand." She tried again to pull away, but this time he shoved her against the bricks. "I said I don't want to hurt you," he whispered, inches from her face. "But I will." The blow came from nowhere. A crack echoed in the alley as she struck his cheek with the back of her hand. He stumbled, surprised, not by the force, but by the fact that she dared. "You think, because I wash other people's filth, I don't know how to fight," she hissed. Brody blinked, recovering his smugness too quickly. "This was your chance," he said, "and you threw it away." Then he was gone, vanished into the shadows. Lucille stood trembling, her back against the brick, her hands shaking from rage and terror. She clutched the envelope to her chest, her breath shallow. She had crossed a threshold, and this time there was no going back. The morning after the attack bled into grey light, a hesitant dawn creeping between the narrow streets of Manhattan. The air smelled of wet stone and coal smoke, the kind of morning that made even the strongest souls feel hollow. Lucille Gardner stood at the wash basin in her small room, scrubbing at the faint streak of blood on her sleeve, her hands trembling so hard the water rippled. Her cheek bore a shadowed bruise, tender to the touch, though she had told no one. Not Mrs. Farnsworth, not the other boarders, and certainly not the man she had risked everything to help. But Edmund Hale knew. When she opened the attic door later that day, he was already standing, his face pale, but his expression dark with restrained fury. The usual calm behind his eyes had been replaced by something sharp and dangerous, a quiet rage that frightened her more than the blow she had taken. "Who did this to you?" His voice was low, almost trembling, but not from weakness. "It doesn't matter," she said quickly, setting down the tray she carried. "I'm fine. Lucille." Her name in his mouth was both plea and command. "Tell me." She tried to step past him, but he caught her wrist, not harshly, but firmly enough to stop her. "Please," he said, softer now. "Don't lie to me." The tremor in his voice disarmed her more than his anger. She drew a breath, eyes flickering toward the window before she spoke. "It was Brody, or someone working for him. He followed me. He wanted to know where you were." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Did he hurt you?" Lucille shook her head, but he saw the bruise. His hand fell to his side, trembling. "He'll pay for this." "Don't," she said, more forcefully than she intended. "Don't make this worse. I can't stand here while you're treated like—" "You'll do nothing," she interrupted. "If you go after him, he'll find you. He'll destroy you. You think men like him care about fairness or law? They care about power, about making an example of those who defy them. You must stay hidden, Edmund." You must." Her voice broke on his name, and when she realized she had said it aloud, she froze. He looked at her, his anger dissolving into something else, something softer, infinitely more dangerous. "Say it again," he whispered. Her breath caught. "No." He stepped closer, each movement deliberate, controlled. "You've said it only once," he murmured, as if it were something forbidden. Her pulse thundered in her throat. "Because it is." The attic seemed to shrink around them, the single candle flickering as though it, too, were holding its breath. Edmund raised a hand, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. His fingertips brushed the side of her face, tracing the faint bruise along her cheekbone. The touch was barely there, yet it burned. "I would trade every fortune I ever made to keep you safe," he said, his voice breaking with emotion he could no longer contain. Her eyes closed against the weight of it. "Don't say things you can't mean. I've never meant anything more." It was then, between fear and longing, that she stopped fighting herself. Her hand rose to his chest, resting against the fabric of his shirt, feeling the steady drum of his heartbeat beneath her palm. He looked at her, not with arrogance, not with pity, but with reverence. The space between them dissolved. The kiss came like a breath stolen, like something neither of them had planned, yet both had awaited for too long. It was gentle at first, hesitant, as if the air itself might shatter under its weight. Then deeper, slower, filled with all the words they could not speak. When they finally broke apart, the silence was trembling, alive. Lucille took a step back, her fingers pressed to her lips, her eyes glistening with the tears she refused to shed. "We can't," she whispered. "You know we can't." He lowered his gaze, nodding. "I know." That night, sleep would not come to either of them. For Lucille, it was the kind of sleeplessness that ached through the bones, where guilt and desire braided themselves into something she could not untangle. For Edmund, it was the helplessness of a man watching everything he had left slip through his grasp. By morning, the boarding house was no longer a place of secrecy. Rumors had spread like fire through dry straw. Mrs. Farnsworth avoided Lucille's eyes during breakfast, but the tightness in her mouth spoke volumes. Something had shifted. When Lucille returned from errands that afternoon, the matron was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs. Her face was grave, her hands folded over her apron. "Miss Gardner," she said, "you have visitors." 2 uniformed policemen stood near the door. Their expressions were unreadable, their presence heavy. Lucille's heart sank. "What do they want?" Mrs. Farnsworth's eyes darted toward the stairwell. "You tell me, child. I've done my duty. I told them everything." The words hit like a slap. "You what?" The woman straightened her shoulders. "I won't harbor criminals under my roof. You've brought danger here. I've got a house to protect." Lucille felt the floor sway beneath her feet. "You told them about him." Mrs. Farnsworth said nothing more. The silence was answer enough. Lucille ran. Up the stairs, 2 at a time, the shouts of the officers echoing behind her. Her lungs burned, her mind screamed only one thought: warn him. She burst through the attic door, breathless. "Edmund, they know! You have to go, now!" He was already dressed, the window half open. His face was pale but calm, his movements swift. "I heard," he said. "I can't stay." "You can't leave either," she argued, clutching his sleeve. "They'll find you on the street." He turned, his hand closing over hers. "If I stay, they'll take you. They'll call you an accomplice. I won't let that happen." "Please." He reached for her cheek again, his thumb brushing the corner of her mouth, a fleeting, desperate caress. "You once said, 'I don't understand fear,'" he murmured. "I do now, because I fear losing you." Before she could answer, he was gone, through the window, into the cold. Moments later, the sound of boots thundered up the stairs. The door crashed open. 2 policemen stormed in, lanterns raised. The light swept across the small room, over the cot, the chair, the half-empty drawer. Empty. Lucille stood frozen by the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to speak, to tell them he was gone, but her voice would not obey. The taller officer stepped forward, his boot striking something near the bed. He bent down and lifted it. A cravat, torn, stained with blood. He held it up, the red marks glistening under the lantern light. "Well," he said grimly, "looks like we've found where he's been." Lucille's knees nearly buckled. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, willing herself not to cry. When the officers turned away, she saw it, a folded slip of paper tucked beneath the edge of the cot. She waited until they left the room, until Mrs. Farnsworth's indignant voice drifted down the hall, before she sank to her knees and reached for it. The handwriting was unmistakable, strong, elegant, the strokes hurried but deliberate. "My dearest Lucille, forgive me. There is no safety for you while I remain. If they come, say nothing. Wait for me at the address written below. I will find a way back to you, I swear it." Below the words was an address, faint, almost smudged, but legible. She clutched the letter to her chest, her tears falling silently onto the ink. Outside, the city hummed in its usual indifference, carriages rolling, street vendors calling, life continuing as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But in that small attic, beneath the broken cravat and the fading warmth of his presence, Lucille felt the world tilt on its axis. She had lost him to protect him, and now she would have to trust that promise written in trembling ink. "Wait for me." The letter had not left her pocket since the moment she read it. Folded so many times, the edges had softened, the ink slightly smudged from her fingertips. It felt less like a piece of paper and more like a lifeline. Lucille Gardner read the words each night by candlelight, whispering them under her breath as though they could summon him. "Wait for me." He had written it in haste, but with a conviction that made her heart clench every time she read it. 3 nights after the police stormed the attic, Lucille left the boarding house under the cloak of darkness. She walked alone down Mercer Street, boots clicking softly against wet cobblestones, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. The fog that had crept in from the Hudson River made the gas lamps glow like distant stars, blurred and trembling. The address led her to the edge of the printing district, where warehouses stood like silent witnesses to the city's buried truths. She paused in front of a building with broken shutters and a rusted iron sign barely hanging from its hinges. The faint smell of ink and old paper lingered in the air. Her fingers hesitated at the doorknob, but her feet did not turn back. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp placed atop a cluttered desk. Stacks of paper, faded posters, and half-disassembled typesetting machines lined the walls. And there, by the rear window, stood Edmund. He turned the moment the door creaked shut. His face was thinner, his coat worn, but his eyes were the same. They softened the moment they found hers. "Lucille," he breathed, stepping forward as if he feared she might vanish again. "You said you'd find a way back to me," she replied, her voice trembling, "so I came to you instead." He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "Are you safe? Did they question you again?" "They searched the attic. They asked questions, but no, they haven't come for me since." A moment of silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say. Then, from the far corner, a man cleared his throat. "Pardon the interruption," he said, stepping into the lamp's glow. He was in his late 50s, with ink-stained fingers and a neatly combed moustache. His eyes were quick and suspicious, though not unkind. "I'm Franklin Malloy. Used to work the books for Hale and Company before they turned into a circus." Lucille nodded politely. "He's been helping me," Edmund said. "We've been tracking the financial trail left behind. Some of the contracts, the bank transactions. They were forged. It's all there. We just need to get the final ledgers." Lucille frowned. "Where are they?" Malloy looked at Edmund grimly. "Secured in the vault archive of First Federal on Delancey. After the collapse, everything was moved under tighter lock. You'll need a miracle to walk out with them." Edmund looked at Lucille. "Or a laundress no one notices." She shook her head. "Don't ask me to do that." "I'm not," he said gently. I'm asking you to walk beside me." It wasn't bravery that made her agree. It wasn't loyalty. It was something deeper, something rooted in the look they had shared the moment their lips met in that attic. She didn't need his promises. She only needed his presence. That night, long after the city had folded into silence, they moved through the streets like shadows. Lucille wore her plainest dress, her apron tied loosely at her waist, a kerchief covering her hair. Edmund kept close, hidden beneath a long wool coat and cap that disguised his familiar features. They entered the bank's back alley, where a service door stood tucked between two coal chutes. Malloy had given them the timing. The night porter stepped out for smoke at exactly 11. They had 5 minutes. Lucille knocked once, then twice, then once again. The door opened to reveal a young boy, barely 16, who looked at her with wide eyes. "Laundry pickup?" he asked. She nodded and held up a sack. "Late request. Miss Blanton's linens. She'll skin me if they're not back before morning." The boy grumbled and stepped aside. Inside, the corridor smelled of damp paper and brass polish. They moved quickly, ducking past the mailroom and descending a narrow flight of stairs into the basement. At the end of the hall, a steel door stood with a single lock and an old iron latch. Edmund produced a small key, a relic of his former life, and turned it slowly. The mechanism clicked. Within the room were shelves lined with ledgers, folders, and financial logs wrapped in twine. He scanned the labels, pulling out 2 thick books marked under his own name. The light from his lantern flickered across the pages. Handwritten notes, forged initials, withdrawals made without authorization. Lucille watched him, her heart heavy. "You trusted these men?" she asked quietly. "I believed they were brothers in arms. Turns out they were wolves in tailored suits." The sound of a door creaking upstairs made them both freeze. "Go," he whispered, tucking the ledgers beneath his coat. "We have what we need." They slipped back through the corridor and exited just before the porter returned, the alley swallowing them once more. As they walked toward the printing house in silence, their steps finally slowed beneath a gas lamp on a quiet corner. Lucille turned to him, breathless from more than just the cold. "You can clear your name now," she said. "I hope so." She hesitated. "And then what?" He met her gaze. "Then I'll ask you if I can spend the rest of my life thanking the woman who risked everything to believe in me." Lucille's breath hitched. "Don't say things you don't mean." "I've never been more certain of anything." His hand brushed hers. Just once. Just enough. She did not pull away. For that single moment the city fell silent. There was no noise, no danger, no distance between them. Just the warmth of 2 souls that had dared to find each other in the coldest of places. But as they turned the final corner near the boarding house, a figure stepped from the shadows. Elias Brodie. "Evening, Miss Gardner," he said coolly. "Out for a stroll with a ghost, are we?" Lucille froze. Edmund stepped in front of her instinctively. "You're under arrest," Brodie said, producing a warrant and signaling to 2 officers behind him. Lucille's voice caught in her throat. "No," but Edmund reached for her hand and pressed the envelope of ledgers into her palm. "Go," he whispered. "Don't let them take this." "Edmund—" He turned and surrendered himself. Lucille stood trembling, her hand clenched around the documents that could save him, as the man she loved was dragged into the night, his freedom stolen once more. The newspapers arrived with the frost. Folded like knives and tossed onto stoops, they fluttered in the early wind like mourning veils. Their headlines shrieked scandal in thick black ink, designed to feed the hunger of a city that thrived on downfall. Wall Street Tycoon found hiding in boardinghouse attic, Edmund Hale in cuffs, ledgers missing the laundress who loved a liar. Lucille Gardner's name was not in the title, but it bled through every paragraph. A woman of no consequence, the article called her, a servant who let her emotions cloud her judgment, shielding a fugitive with a tarnished name and a stolen fortune. The tone mocked, the words dripped with disdain. And the worst of it, every tenant in the boarding house read it over their morning tea as if it were theatre. She had known, the moment Brodie pulled Edmund into the street, that her world would collapse. But she had not anticipated the violence of shame. She had not imagined that people who once smiled at her in passing would now avert their eyes, or worse, whisper behind cupped hands. By noon that day, Mrs. Farnsworth summoned her with a look of frozen distaste. "You've brought disgrace under my roof," she said, folding her arms across her starched apron. "You'll be gone by sunset." Lucille did not plead. She gathered her belongings in silence, each item folded with dignity that refused to bend beneath humiliation. As she walked down the narrow hallway one last time, a child peeked from behind a cracked door and stared at her as if she were a villain from a penny novel. Outside, the wind cut through her shawl. Her hands were chapped and empty. She had no home, no employment, and no place in the world. But in her pocket were the ledgers. She clutched them as she walked, her boots echoing against the wet stone of the street. Carriages passed. Men laughed loudly outside taverns. Women clutched their gloves and looked away. In every window the papers screamed Edmund's name, but not the truth. He was no thief, and she was not a fool. She stopped at the corner of Washington and Prince, heart pounding, then turned and entered the modest brick building with a brass plaque above the door that read, "The Evening Chronicle." The receptionist, a girl no older than 16, blinked at her. "Are you here to deliver laundry?" Lucille straightened her shoulders. "No, I have a story." The girl hesitated, then gestured toward a door with the word "Editor" etched in faded gold. Inside, a woman with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on the edge of her nose looked up from a stack of pages. "I don't do charity," she said, flipping another sheet. "I'm not asking for it," Lucille replied. "I have the truth." The woman paused. "Is this about Edmund Hale?" Lucille placed the envelope of ledgers on the desk. "I lived under the same roof. I know what really happened. I know who he is. And I know who he's not." The woman studied her, lips pursed, eyes sharp. "They say you were his laundress." "I was," Lucille said, "but I'm also the only person who listened when he spoke the truth." There was silence, long and evaluating. "Sit," the editor said at last, "and talk." Lucille spoke for over an hour. She told the story plainly, without embellishment, about the moment she first saw him bleeding and silent in the attic, about the quiet dignity in his eyes, about the moment she realized he was not hiding from justice, but from betrayal. She told of the false contracts, the forged signatures, the fear that had clung to him like a shadow. She said nothing of the kiss, but everything in her voice betrayed what words could not. The editor listened, writing notes furiously, her expression unreadable. When Lucille finished, she stood. "I don't ask for praise. I only ask that people hear the other side." The editor looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Come back tomorrow." That night, Lucille stayed at a charity home for displaced working women. The bed was narrow, the blanket thin, but she slept with her hand over her heart and a strange sense of stillness beneath her ribs. She had spoken. She had dared. The next morning, the city awoke to a new headline. "The woman who dared to love a Wall Street ghost." Lucille's name appeared in bold beneath it, not as a servant, not as a scandal, but as a voice. She stood outside a newsstand and read every word, her breath catching when she reached the final lines. Perhaps the greatest crime in this story is not a missing fortune, but the ease with which we crucify the voiceless. In a city built on walls of wealth, it takes a laundress to remind us what truth costs and what loyalty looks like when polished not in gold, but in silence. People stared at her as she walked, but this time the whispers were different. A nod, a glance of respect. A woman from the bakery offered her a warm roll without charge. A young boy handed her a folded paper and smiled. She was no longer invisible. At the prison, Edmund Hale sat behind cold iron bars, his coat removed, his face pale, his dignity intact. The guards said nothing as they passed his cell, but that morning a clerk brought him a paper. He read the headline, then the article. Then he closed his eyes. Lucille's words had found him, and with them, hope. The winter morning dawned grey and unyielding over lower Manhattan, the kind of day when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The courthouse loomed above the street, its stone columns streaked by years of soot and rain, a monument not to justice, but to the men who believed they owned it. Outside, the crowd swelled, merchants, clerks, factory hands and society ladies wrapped in velvet cloaks, all drawn by the spectacle promised in the headlines. The trial of Edmund Hale begins. Lucille Gardner approached the steps quietly, her black dress borrowed, the hem slightly frayed, but brushed to neatness. Her gloves were too thin for the cold, yet she did not shiver. She had spent her last coin on the carriage that brought her here, and refused to let the chill betray her nerves. She had not seen Edmund since that night, when Brody's men had dragged him into the fog. Now, every step toward the courtroom felt like walking through the ruins of her own resolve. Inside, the chamber was suffocating. The air reeked of sweat, ink and polished wood. The benches were packed, every seat taken by faces hungry for scandal. On one side sat reporters with sharpened pencils. On the other, ladies whispered behind gloved hands, their curiosity veiled as moral indignation. Then she saw him. Edmund stood beside his counsel, his wrists unshackled, but his dignity wounded by weeks of imprisonment. His once clean coat was worn, his jaw shadowed by fatigue, yet his bearing, still proud, still impossibly composed, silenced her breath. When their eyes met, something flickered across his face. Disbelief, relief, and the faintest trace of something she dared not name. She took her place near the back, lowering her gaze as the judge entered. The sound of the gavel struck like thunder. The trial began. The prosecutor was a man of sharp voice and sharper ambition. He painted Edmund as a deceiver, a financial manipulator who had betrayed investors, ruined lives, and faked his own death to escape ruin. He used words like arrogant and cold-hearted, the kind meant to turn a man into a monster. Lucille clenched her hands in her lap. Each accusation struck her like a physical blow. But then, when the prosecutor waved a ledger above his head, the one she and Edmund had risked everything to retrieve, she leaned forward, heart racing. He could not know what it truly contained. Not yet. At last, the defense called its witnesses. When her name was spoken, Miss Lucille Gardner, the murmurs in the room swelled. Some snickered, others gasped. She rose, her knees trembling, and made her way to the stand. She could feel their eyes crawling over her, the laundress, the scandal, the woman who had hidden a fugitive in an attic. The laundress lover, the papers had called her. She kept her chin high. The judge's gaze was stern, but not unkind. "State your occupation, Miss Gardner." "I am a laundress, Your Honor," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I was employed in Mrs. Farnsworth's boarding house on Delancey Street." "And how do you know the defendant, Mr. Hale?" The courtroom stilled. Lucille looked at Edmund, and for a moment, everything else fell away. "I found him wounded," she said simply. "He had been attacked. He said little of himself at first, but I knew he was not the man the papers described." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor rose. "Miss Gardner, are you suggesting that every article printed these past months is a lie?" "I'm suggesting," she replied, steady now, "that you cannot know a man from ink and rumour. I saw not the Tycoon you condemn, but a man betrayed, left for dead, and too proud to beg the world to listen." He smirked. "And yet you hid him. Why?" Lucille hesitated. Her throat tightened. "Because he needed someone," she whispered, "and because I could not live with myself if I turned away." The prosecutor leaned closer. "Or perhaps because you hoped to gain something from his gratitude." A quiet gasp rippled through the audience. Lucille's cheeks burned, but she did not flinch. "I gained nothing," she said, "and I expect nothing. I only wanted the truth known." The judge silenced the room with a sharp rap of his gavel. "Enough, Mr. Darrow." When she stepped down, Edmund's gaze followed her. He did not smile, but his eyes spoke what his lips could not: gratitude, awe, and a kind of love that transcended the weight of walls and eyes that judged. Then came the defense's final move. Franklin Malloy, the old accountant who had risked his own safety to help Edmund, produced the ledgers, the same ones Lucille had carried through the alleyways of the city. The courtroom leaned forward as the pages were turned, revealing forged signatures, falsified transfers, and handwriting that did not match Edmund's. Every transaction pointed to another name: Charles Weston, Edmund's former partner, who had vanished from the city the very week the scandal broke. The silence that followed was electric. The prosecutor's face drained of color. Then came the murmur, a sound like wind before a storm, as realization spread. The audience turned, restless, murmuring Edmund's name with a new inflection, curiosity instead of condemnation, admiration instead of disgust. The judge's gavel struck 3 times. Order. When the verdict was read, not guilty on all counts, Lucille closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. Edmund turned toward her. For a heartbeat, he did not move. Then he stepped forward, ignoring the reporters shouting his name, the flash of cameras, the lawyers at his side. He stopped in front of her where she stood near the aisle. The air between them trembled with unspoken words. "Lucille," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion he could no longer contain. "I owe my life to you. My name, my freedom, everything I am now belongs to you." Her breath hitched. "Don't say that. I mean every word," he said, his hand hovering near hers, afraid to touch. "I would give you the world if it would make you forget what you've endured for me." Tears welled in her eyes. "You can't give me the world, Edmund. It was never built for women like me." "Then I'll build another one." Her heart twisted, aching with love and fear all at once. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, murmuring, watching, recording this impossible tableau of a tycoon and a laundress bound by a truth that neither wealth nor shame could erase. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Lucille walked alone through the quiet streets. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and soundless. Every step she took left a print that vanished almost instantly. Her mind replayed the day in fragments, the gavel's echo, the gasp of the audience, the tremor in Edmund's voice. Freedom had come at last. But for whom? When she reached the modest room she had rented in a women's lodging house, she found a small bouquet of winter lilies waiting on her pillow, their scent delicate and unexpected. A note lay beside them in Edmund's familiar hand. "Tomorrow, I'll come for you." Her chest tightened. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering lamplight against the window pane. The city was alive outside, but within her was only quiet turmoil. The thought of standing beside him, of becoming part of his world of marble and chandeliers, terrified her more than the trial ever had. He deserved freedom, respect, redemption. She had given him those. But love demanded more than courage. It demanded the impossible, a crossing of the invisible line that divided their worlds. She stood and began to pack her small trunk. Her hands trembled as she folded her dresses, her shawl, the worn gloves he had once touched. Each item felt like a goodbye. She was too cowardly to speak aloud. The door creaked open behind her. She turned, startled. Edmund stood there, snow still melting on his shoulders, his breath visible in the cold air. He said nothing at first, only watched her, his gaze lingering on the half-packed trunk, the trembling of her hands. "So," he said quietly, "you meant to disappear." Lucille swallowed hard. "I can't stay. I don't belong in your world." He stepped forward, his voice steady but soft. "Then I'll build a world where you belong." She froze, her fingers curling around the fabric of her shawl. His words hung in the air, fragile and luminous. For the first time since she had met him, she saw no trace of the fallen tycoon or the man of wealth. Only a man stripped bare of pride, offering her something no fortune could buy, a promise made not to possess her, but to keep her safe. Her throat closed around unshed tears, and though she said nothing, her silence was its own answer. the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Spring had crept into the city with quiet defiance, melting the soot-dusted snow that had clung to rooftops and alleys for months. Trees, long, bare and skeletal, now bore the palest green on their branches, and the Hudson no longer whispered of frost, but of rebirth. Manhattan, still brash and brutal in its ambitions, softened for a moment under the gentle hand of April. Edmund Hale walked its streets as a changed man. It had been 3 months since the verdict, 3 months since the courtroom had erupted in gasps, since he had been offered his old world back on a silver tray. But Edmund had not returned to Wall Street. The tycoons, the investors, the men in tailored coats who had once courted his approval, all expected him to reclaim his seat at the table. He had refused, because the only seat he wanted was beside her. Lucille had vanished after that final fragile night, like mist at dawn. She had left no address, no word, no sign, and so he searched. Every week he walked the neighborhoods that had once meant nothing to him. 5 Points, Hell's Kitchen, the Lower East Side, now the beating heart of his longing. He spoke to laundresses, seamstresses, orphan matrons, and women who wore weariness like a shawl. He left his name at lodging houses, shelters and storefronts where the scent of starch and lie clung to the walls. And as he searched, he built, not an empire, not this time, a foundation. Quiet, modest, and named not for himself, but for her, the Lucille Gardner house, a haven for working women, widows and girls too young to know how the world would try to shape them. It opened in a converted brownstone on Bleecker Street, its windows scrubbed and its floors worn but warm. There was a reading room, a pantry, and a classroom lit by oil lamps where letters and numbers came alive on chalkboards. Still, he could not rest. He found her on a Wednesday. The laundry shop was tucked into a narrow alley off Broome Street, marked only by a chipped wooden sign and the familiar scent of steam and soap. It was a humble place, barely more than a room, with a coal stove in the corner and drying lines stretched across the ceiling. He stepped inside and time collapsed. Lucille stood at the basin, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands immersed in water that clouded with lye. Her hair was pinned in a loose knot, damp with sweat, a few curls falling over her cheek. She looked up and froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He had imagined this meeting 1,000 times. He had rehearsed words of forgiveness, declarations of love, even noble speeches of letting her go if it meant her peace. But when their eyes met, all he said was her name, Lucille. Her lips parted in disbelief. Edmund. He stepped closer, not as a man of wealth or triumph, but as a man who had crossed 100 blocks of humility to find the woman who had saved his soul. "I've been looking for you," he said gently. "Every day, every alley, every name scratched on a door." She swallowed, setting the wet sheet aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" "Because everything I was, everything I thought I needed, none of it matters if I can't share it with you." Lucille looked down at her hands, red from work, damp from rinse water. "This is where I belong. I've known nothing else." "Then I will belong here too," he said. "If this is where you are, then this is where I kneel." And he did. Right there on the wet floor between soap buckets and steam, he knelt. The man who once closed million-dollar deals, who once dined beneath chandeliers, now knelt beside a wash basin, water seeping into his fine boots. "I'm not asking you to leave this behind," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm asking you to let me help you build something new, together, on your terms." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small, velvet-wrapped box. Not the kind seen in shop windows, but a modest one, worn at the edges. Inside was a ring. The band was thin, gold with a tiny opal, the same shade as the sky on the morning of their first kiss. Her breath caught. "I bought this months ago," he confessed. "Carried it with me through every corner of the city, hoping, waiting." Lucille's eyes shimmered. She looked not at the ring, but at the man, the way he trembled, the way his hands were no longer smooth, the way his gaze was stripped of pride. She reached for him, not to lift him, but to join him. Their hands met in the space between suds and dreams, and this time she did not pull away. "Yes," she said, the word barely audible, but it was enough. They married quietly. No grand cathedral, no society page, only a handful of women from the foundation, a minister from the neighborhood parish, and the scent of lilies gathered from the park. She wore a dress sewn by her own hand, ivory cotton with lace at the collar. He wore the same coat from the trial, pressed with care. Their vows were simple. "I do. Not just today," she whispered, "but for all the days when no one else saw me." "And I do," he replied, "for all the days I failed to see myself, until you." Their home rose modestly on the edge of Washington Square, a house not of grandeur but of warmth. The parlor was filled with sunlight, the walls lined with books and flowers, and the laughter of young girls learning to read. Lucille, now Mrs. Hale, sat each morning by the window, her hands ink-stained from teaching. She taught not only letters and numbers, but self-worth, resilience, the quiet power of a voice once dismissed. And Edmund, he no longer ruled from towers. He poured tea for visiting seamstresses, shoveled snow from the steps, and kissed his wife's temple with reverence that spoke more than any vow ever could. In the city that once devoured dreams, they built something the world could not buy, a home, a legacy, and a love that knew no titles. The last words were written not in ink, but in the echoes of the girls' laughter, in the scent of lavender and soap, in the warmth of a home built from ruin. He had once been the heir to Wall Street, but she was the one who taught him the worth of a soul. The winter of 1897 had come quietly to Manhattan, blanketing the city in a hush that softened even the clamor of carriage wheels on cobblestone and the clinking of coins in gloved hands. Snow adorned the iron railings like lace, and gaslights flickered behind frost-kissed windows. The world had changed, subtly, stubbornly, as it always did. But inside the house on Washington Square, time moved to the rhythm of something older, something steadier, the pulse of a love that had survived everything. Lucille Hale stood at the front window, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hands resting gently on the slight curve of her belly. At 37, she bore the marks of a life lived fully, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, softened hips from motherhood, a gaze sharpened not by hardship, but by wisdom. Her hair, once always pinned, now fell in loose waves when she was home, streaked with the faintest thread of silver, though Edmund often called it moonlight. Behind her, the parlor hummed with warmth and life. A fire crackled, laughter echoed from the adjacent room, where two boys, 10-year-old Thomas and 8-year-old James, chased each other between shelves of donated books and stacks of stitched linens. Their sister, little Eleanor, sat cross-legged on the rug, her curls tumbling around her cheeks, pretending to read aloud to her porcelain doll. Edmund sat nearby, his spectacles perched low on his nose as he balanced account books for the foundation. His once dark hair had lightened at the temples, and though he walked slower now and carried a cane, his leg never quite the same after that final winter, his eyes had never lost their fire. Especially not when they landed on Lucille. "You're staring again," she teased softly, turning from the window. "I am," he admitted without apology. 8 years, and you still catch me." She smiled. "You promised to build me a world, and you did." He rose, crossing the room to her side. "No, we built it together, brick by brick, lesson by lesson, kiss by kiss." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the snow fall. The Lucille Gardner Foundation had grown beyond what either of them had imagined. What began as a haven for laundresses now included a trade school for women, a shelter for young girls, and reading rooms across 5 boroughs. Every building bore her name. Every woman who walked through its doors was met not with charity, but with dignity. The society that once scorned her name had changed too, slowly, reluctantly. But her interview all those years ago, the voice of a laundress who dared to love a tycoon, had stirred something in the city. It had made headlines. It had sparked protests. It had inspired change. And what of Brody? He had fled the city in disgrace after the trial, hounded by both the press and former allies. Rumors placed him in Havana, then London, then gone entirely. Edmund never spoke of him, and Lucille never asked. Some shadows were better left in the past. Mrs. Farnsworth had not survived the decade. Her boarding house had closed, swallowed by real estate speculation and new city ordinances. No one mourned her passing loudly, but Lucille visited the old address once a year, placing lilies by the gate. Not in forgiveness, but in closure. As for love, it had aged, yes, but it had not dimmed. Their passion was quieter now. It lived in the way Edmund covered her sewing basket each night, in the way Lucille added honey to his tea without asking, in the way their fingers still found each other beneath the dinner table, brushing, holding, remembering. Some evenings, when the children were asleep and the city was still, they returned to the laundry room where it all began. It had been preserved, untouched, at Lucille's insistence. Buckets, linens, coal stove and all. A tiny museum of a life reborn. They would sit on the bench by the basin side by side, hands entwined, letting memory do the rest. "Do you ever miss it?" she once asked him. "The empire," he replied. "Never." And he meant it. Because the empire he now ruled had no columns or dividends. It was made of bedtime stories and stitched quilts, of hands held during childbirth, of tears wiped during funerals, of community meetings, of girls learning to sign their names, of women no longer whispering when they said, "I matter." Outside the snow kept falling, inside the fire burned warm. And at the center of it all stood a laundress who had dared to love a fallen tycoon, and who, in doing so, had not only changed one man's life, but had rewritten her own place in history. The world would remember Edmund Hale, but it would never forget Lucille. Some stories begin in parlors of gold, but the ones that stay with us begin in laundry rooms, in quiet courage, in glances held longer than expected. Lucille was never meant to be remembered. Society gave her no title, no fortune, no power. And yet, she changed a man's destiny, exposed corruption, and inspired an entire city with nothing but her voice, her hands, and her heart. And Edmund, a man once lost in the shadows of greed, found redemption not through riches, but through love. Real love. The kind that doesn't demand perfection, only truth. This is not just a tale of romance. It's a story of resilience, of class barriers shattered, of dignity reclaimed. A reminder that love doesn't ask where you come from. It only asks who you are when the world isn't looking. If you felt moved by this journey, if your heart stirred as Lucille's did, please share this story with someone who still believes in the power of hope and second chances. And if you made it to the very end, write the word soul in the comments. That way, we'll know who walked every step of this path with us, and you'll help others discover this tale as well. Don't forget to explore the other unforgettable stories waiting for you in the cards above. Each one is filled with emotion, twists, and characters that will stay with you long after the final line. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling. Until the next story.